Boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos à abertura do nosso Labô Lectures 2021. Me falem se estou sendo ouvida, se as imagens estão boas e se está tudo claro aí para vocês. É um grande prazer hoje a gente começar essa temporada de Labô Lectures aqui com o professor Bryan Caplan, que foi convidado por nosso embaixador do Labô, coordenador do grupo de comportamento político, Fernando Amedi, e antes do professor Bryan Caplan falar, eu vou dar algumas instruções que são as seguintes. Fiquem, boa tarde, Anabela, boa tarde, Paola, boa tarde a todo mundo que está aqui. Eu vou falar o seguinte só, o professor Fernando vai começar a apresentar o professor Caplan, o professor Pondé vai dar as boas-vindas e nós começamos o papo. Sempre que tiverem alguma dúvida, algum questionamento sobre a palestra, por favor, coloquem aí nos comentários, ou em português ou em inglês, se for em português, nós traduzimos. Só peço uma coisa, para as perguntas serem curtas, porque a gente não tem como traduzir e falar, vamos dizer, mini dissertações de mestrado aqui ao vivo. Então, muito obrigada, Fernando, por favor.
Ok, Andréia, vamos lá. Então, uma felicidade muito grande estar aqui, né, junto com o professor Bryan Caplan, a Andréia e o Luiz Felipe Pondé, né? Então, o professor Caplan, ele é professor de economia na George Mason University. Ele é autor de obras que, infelizmente, não estão traduzidas em português, The Myth of the Rational Voter e Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, dentre outras. Então, é uma felicidade muito grande recebê-lo aqui. Felipe Pondé.
Well, Professor Bryan Caplan, it's a pleasure to have you here with us at our lab. Okay, we research politics, behavior, and media at the Catholic University of São Paulo. Okay, and it's a real pleasure to be able to hear you. I read your book about the rational voter. Is a great book, very important for us here. So the word is yours, as we say here in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Brazil, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm going to do everything I can to have you not fall asleep today. So I've done so many Zoom meetings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and forth between my slides and actual me, and I'm also going to try to get translations of key terms at key points, and then I will open it up for questions afterwards, and maybe I'll do a few questions in the middle. We'll see what works best. All right, so let me start by sharing my screen now. Okay, there we are. Okay, so this is a talk based upon a book that I'm writing called Poverty, Who's to Blame? And let me just give you the background. So the book is not done. I'm in the middle of it. I'm actually pausing this book to write a different book first. But anyway, it will happen eventually. So the book in progress, Poverty, Who to Blame? So it straddles moral philosophy and social science. So I want to do two things at once. I want to think about the good and the right, but I also want to think about what's going on in the real world and then put them together. So what I want to do in moral philosophy, first of all, I want to flesh out a plausible moral theory of blame. So I want to think about what is blameworthy, what is not blameworthy, what's in between. And then secondly, I want to apply this moral theory to poverty, and especially absolute poverty. All right, now usually I'm in the United States giving this talk where we don't really know much about absolute poverty. In Brazil, I know you know a lot more than we do. All right, but you probably know the story of Jean Valjean from Les Miserables, right? The song says he stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's son. And here I say this is the kind of poverty that makes sense to people in all places and times, and why it's something that is troubling, why it's something that weighs on people's consciences. Whereas the kind of poverty that most Americans know, where you can't afford a good cell phone, that is really one where you have to be very spoiled to worry about. Now, secondly, for the social science part, I want to figure out how much of global poverty can be properly blamed on anyone, and then think about who are the main sources, main ones to blame. So primary culprits. So here's one that you should appreciate in Brazil. First of all, blame third world governments for bad development policies. So I'm going to tell you that there are formulas for growing from poverty to riches, which are reliable and have been known for a long time. And yet some countries like Brazil just don't do them. All right. Secondly, I'm also going to blame first world governments for bad immigration policies. Right. So even if all the third world has bad policies, if you could just move to rich countries and get away from bad policies, this would also have greatly reduced or eliminated absolute poverty. And then I'm also going to talk about what I call the secondary culprits, which is the poor themselves for irresponsible behavior. All right. Now, a strange thing about this talk is that no matter how many times I say it, almost I'll talk about many different parts of poverty, many different causes, almost everyone wants to go and talk about this last part, that last line. So many people get very upset about the idea that you could hold the poor in any way responsible for their behavior, for their poverty. What I'm going to say is sometimes you should, not always, sometimes. All right, now, just starting off in the moral philosophy part. So we call this the blame game. You know, does that rhyme in Portuguese? I'm guessing not.
No,
right?
it doesn't rhyme.
Yeah, so in English it rhymes, and so it's more, it's funnier.
Yeah.
All right, but no. All right, so how do you say blame game in Portuguese?
O jogo da culpa.
Jogo da culpa.
Da culpa.
Da culpa.
Blame in Portuguese is culpa.
Culpa, yes,
Culpa,
like in Latin.
Yes.
All right. Mea culpa.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay, great. All right, so suppose person A has a problem. Who is to blame? Now we could spend a lot of time on moral philosophy, but I only have a little bit of time, so I'm just going to tell you my answers. And I'm going to say that in daily life, they are probably your answers too, even though what I'm going to say is very different from the grand moral and political theories that many people officially hold. All right, so first, if A's problem is literally unavoidable, no one is to blame for it. So you can't blame someone for gravity, right? It's just not avoidable. Secondly, more importantly, if there are reasonable steps that A could take or could have taken to avoid the problem, then it is fair to say that A is to blame for his own problem. Next, if A could have avoided his problem by taking reasonable steps, but someone else, another person B, refused to leave A alone to take such steps, then B is to blame for A's problem. So if A could have solved his own problem, but B wouldn't let you, then it makes sense to blame B. And last, if B had nothing to do with A's problem, but could solve it at a reasonable cost, B is probably still not to blame for A's problem. Right. So in philosophy, there is a concept called supererogation, and it means going above and beyond the call of duty, going above and beyond the call of duty. A nice example of this is the story of the Good Samaritan. So is biblical education at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo good enough? So you've heard of the Good Samaritan? What do you call the Good Samaritan in Portuguese?
O bom samaritano.
Okay, great. All right, so to remind you of the story, in the story, there is a man who is attacked and in ancient Israel, and he's left for dead. And then a couple of supposedly great people ignore him and don't help him. And then a Samaritan comes by. Now, a Samaritan is actually just a very slightly different kind of Jew, but at the time, people thought they were terrible. There still are Samaritans alive, by the way, a few thousand Samaritans left alive in Israel. All right, but in any case, so what the guy does is he goes and he gives him first aid, and then he goes and puts him on his donkey, and then he rides him to an inn, and he pays for a couple of days of rent at the inn. And that's it. That's all he does. And we're still talking about him today. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this guy. It's like, well, what was so great about what he did? All he did is give him some first aid, spent a little money, and he left. Right? And the answer was great because the guy was a stranger. He helped a stranger. He had no obligation to him. And we don't think of this as something that he had to do. We think of it as something heroic. So that is what I have in mind. All right, now, so this is the background in moral philosophy. Now thinking about the problem of poverty itself. Now we get to social science. Right? So I don't have to tell people in Brazil that there are a lot of people who still live in dire poverty. So I know Brazil's a middle income country, but it's also a very unequal country. So I assume everyone there has seen some very severe poverty. So, so about almost 1 billion people live in dire poverty below $1.25 a day. Actually, probably with COVID, there's a lot more than 1 billion people living in dire poverty now. All right. And the absolutely poor, they don't just have fewer luxuries. They face hunger, homelessness, early death, bad stuff. Now, there is an important psychological phenomenon called hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation. It means that people get used to their problems and also their good stuff. They get used to their luxuries and their problems. What this means is that people who are absolutely poor are not as miserable as Americans would assume. All right, so I'm sure if you go to a favela in Brazil, you see some people who are happy. Some people smile and laugh even when they're in poverty, but still absolute poverty is an awful problem. All right, now here's a part that I show to Americans. I'll show you also just so you know how spoiled Americans are. All right, so I use memes just to remind Americans about absolute poverty. So have you guys seen this first world problem meme? Yeah, so I'm so hungry, but I don't want to cook. All right, probably a lot of people in Brazil would think that's a strange problem. Like, what do you mean? You're unhappy to cook your food and eat it, and you're sad? I don't understand. Right?
But we have those same memes here in Brazil as
Yes.
well. We
Yes.
can totally identify with them.
Okay, great. You can still identify with them, but you understand what a real problem is.
Of course.
Yes, it's not. A lot of Americans don't really understand what a real problem is. Like, you have to educate them. You realize this could be something that a person would have, and most people around the world and throughout history have had problems like this. And the problems that you complain about would have made no sense to them. You would have to give them a lecture to get them to understand how a person could be sad about the problem you have, because it seems like something to be happy about. All right, or so mom asks what I want for Christmas, can't think of anything. Staying with relatives, they don't know their Wi-Fi password. All right, so problems like that. All right, now bringing these two ideas together, the moral philosophy and the facts of poverty. So who, if anyone, is to blame for the problem of poverty? So in the pre-modern world, the right answer was often no one, because dire poverty is mankind's natural state. Poor is what we are unless we do some amazing things, right? Which we know because throughout most of human history, almost everyone was poor. In fact, you might even say everyone was poor before the 20th century. Even kings were poor because they didn't have vaccines, they didn't have food that didn't spoil, and so on. All right, but we can also say, though, is that the first world is what we call an existence proof, that reasonable steps to avoid absolute poverty exist. Right. So in math, an existence proof is where you show, look, we may not know the exact answer, but we know there is an answer. An answer is available. We just have to figure out what it is. And I'd say you can go and look at first world countries and you see there is a way to get out of poverty. It can be done. All right, now, how can it be done? All right. So this is a part where I'm going through the evidence much more closely as I write. But here's still the primary steps according to my provisional research. So my early answer, right? So step one, right? Third world government should end bad development policies, and especially against multinational business. Instead of complaining about multinational business, third world countries should say, thank you, you are wonderful. We want as many of you and as much of you as we can possibly get. What can we do to make your experience in Brazil better? All right, secondly, first world government should end bad immigration policies, especially against low-skilled guest workers. So when people want to go to a first world country to work, they should be allowed to do so. And then secondary step, the poor themselves should avoid irresponsible behavior. And again, especially impulsive sex. So I'm going to talk about this more, but it doesn't take a genius to understand that having impulsive sex makes poverty much more likely and much more difficult to deal with. Because when you have impulsive sex, often you are likely to have kids that you're not ready to take care of. And when you have kids you aren't ready to take care of, you then find, well, what am I supposed to do? I can't take my baby to my job, so how am I going to earn a living? All right, so now let's go through all of these main causes of poverty. And as I said, blameworthy causes of poverty. So starting with third world governments, and notice on the map, Brazil is the worst color on the map. right? Brazil's red. Red's the worst color. All right. But anyway, economic policy is a choice. It's not a law of nature. There isn't any reason why Brazil has to have the policies that it does. Brazil could have American policies. Brazil could have Swiss policies. Brazil could have the policies of Hong Kong, right? Or Chile, right? It's very obvious Brazil could have the policies of Chile, right? How do you say Chile in Portuguese?
The same thing, Chile.
Chile. You say Chile? Chile?
No,
okay.
we don't have this chi, so it's Chile.
Chile.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
Right. So it is different. All right, that's funny. Okay. So third world governments have long chosen badly. Third world governments have long chosen badly. All right. And again, this is exactly what we expect. So, countries that have been poor for a very long time, isn't the obvious story that they've been doing bad policy for a long time? So, what are these bad decisions? So, of course, there's old school socialism, Soviet style socialism, Cuban style socialism, right? Or, God forbid, Venezuelan style socialism. All right. So where the government takes over most of industry and runs it directly, then there's this expropriation, just seizing investors' assets, right? That's actually more like Venezuela, right? Venezuela is more just like looting and chaos than actual Soviet-style socialism. And then there's autarky, just trying to cut yourself off from the rest of the world, say you're trying to rob us and we're going to produce everything ourselves. So that's actually is a long Brazilian tradition, right? Of trying to, Brazilian products for the Brazilian people. So in the US, we have Buy American. You say Buy Brazilian? Is that a slogan?
No, we don't. Kind of, but we don't.
What's the slogan of autarky?
I don't.
What's the most popular slogan?
I don't. Brazil for Brazilians. Maybe
Brazil
like something. Maybe
right.
Something like that.
Yes. All right. Now, if we take a look, economic freedom in the third world remains very low, and very low economic freedom strongly predicts poverty and low growth. So just take a look at the map. The blue parts are the freest economies. The red parts are the least free economies. And yeah, so we've got all these big red parts in South America and in most of Africa, and then a few other places in the world. Notice those gray areas, like some of the gray areas are actually the least free countries in the world. It's just that we don't have any data for them. So North Korea is probably way worse than Brazil, but it's so terrible that no one gets out alive to report anything. And so they just put it as gray. Right. But anyway, you take a look and you can see a very large area of South America is red, but it doesn't have to be. So look over at Chile. Chile is blue, right? And you can see, of course, United States and Canada, all blue, United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, Denmark, are all in blue, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all in blue, right? And again, we then go and take a look at economic freedom and income per capita. There it's quite obvious that the freer you are, the richer you are. But then for growth, this is one where it's very striking. So if you look at the top 3 quartiles of growth, there isn't that big of a difference in economic growth for the top 3 levels, but look at the bottom one. Bottom quartile has terrible growth, huge difference. So it really looks like a lot of the harm just comes from being in the red. Unfortunately, Brazil is in the red. If you could just get out of the red, just liberalize enough to be yellow, then looks like things would be a lot better. Now, of course, the other thing to remember is that economic policy stays very similar over time. So when you see that blue countries are very rich, a lot of that is the cumulative effect of having had high economic freedom for a long time. So you can't expect that the day that Brazil finally liberalizes and has higher economic freedom, we'll get rich. And instead, it'll be like Chile, where they start off under near socialism, under Allende, and then you have a few decades of better policies, and then you see a transformation. All right, now thinking more about the details. There were 2 great 1995 papers by Sachs and Warner. What they said is just avoiding a short, clear list of awful economic policies is a sufficient condition for solid long-run economic growth. And again, what are these awful economic policies? 1, Soviet-style socialism, expropriation, autarky. All right, so those 3 totally idiotic kinds of policies. Right? Quote from the paper, they say, there is not a single country in our sample, which covers 117 countries, and approximately 90% of the world's population as of 1985, which pursued appropriate policies during 1970 to 89, and yet which had per capita growth of less than 1.2% per year, and not a single qualifying developing country, which grew at less than 2% per year. Right? So that means that you just avoid the stupid policies and you grow. And in the data that they had 100% of the time. Right? So when people say, oh, growth is so complicated, there's no hard, the right formula varies so much. No. One formula, avoid sheer stupidity, and every single country in the data set grows. All right, something else to know. Shock therapy in the ex-communist world totally worked. There's been so much complaining about shock therapy in the Soviet bloc and, oh, the horrible human cost. And, oh, yes, it was so awful. And it totally didn't work, right? This is really, like, you should think about all of this as propaganda by people who never wanted any reform anyway, right? And what happened to the countries that went slow? They went so slow they didn't change, like Belarus. So how do we know this? Well, simple fact, the countries that reformed the most did the best. Countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, that reformed the most did the best, right? Countries that reformed intermediate amounts, like Russia, they had intermediate outcomes. And the countries that reformed the least, countries like Belarus, they're the disasters, right? And yet notice, just understand what's so wrong about the way that people think about this and just how untrustworthy the critics are. The number of people who've complained about shock therapy, vast, compared to the number that have said Belarus is still a disaster, almost no one. All right, so I think this does give you an idea about the real motives, which is the complainers never really wanted change to happen anyway. And when they talk about, oh, well, we thought it would totally work and then the facts changed our minds. No, that's not what happened. What happened is you never believed. And when it totally worked, you nevertheless looked for any excuse to complain. And complained you did, to try to be a tool of governments like that of Belarus. Right. Now, one exception here, Bill Easterly is an economist who I will not say had a sympathy for Soviet-style regimes, but he did express earlier doubts. And anyway, so in a recent paper, even he says, all right, fine, liberalization did work over the long run. Maybe it was just not fair to go and look 2 or 3 years in and say, hey, things aren't good yet, so it didn't work. All right. Now, closely related to all this, and now I want to get into more specific policies that are really bad in third world countries. So there's been a very interesting body of work on managerial quality done by people like Nicholas Bloom and John Van Reenen. And what they do is they find large benefits of common sense best practices in management. Now so what they did is they've done these very large international surveys of businesses around the world, and they've got the following results. Result 1. Government firms are very poorly managed, right? And these are not people with any free market or libertarian sympathies. They're data wonks, and they looked as, hey, government firms are very poorly managed. All right. Secondly, the poorer the country, the worse the management. Yes, Brazil is on this chart. If you take a look, it's the second worst. Brazil has the second worst managed companies in this survey, better only than Greece. Better only than Greece. Well, close to Portugal, actually, interestingly. All right. But anyway, the poorer the country, the worse the management. The richest countries have the best managed firms. The poorest countries have the worst managed firms. But with an amazing exception, multinational corporations, multinational firms, the very firms that developing countries treat with suspicion or hostility. Take a look at them, and they are well managed in almost all countries. So look again for Brazil. Domestic firms in Brazil are very poorly managed, near the bottom. Go in though and take a look at the foreign multinationals in Brazil. Foreign multinationals are managed at about maybe even above the average level for multinationals around the world. Why? Because multinational corporations, their software, their ideas about how to run things, ideas about how to keep track of inventory and how to pay people for performance, and how to which new products to offer, how to set up a store. They've got lots of plans that they offer. And when you set up a multinational corporation in Brazil, you download the multinational model to the Brazilian server, and then you run it. And multinationals are great at making their software run everywhere. Right. And key fact is that by getting your management up to first world levels, you can get your productivity up to very similar levels too, right? So the ideal would really be for multinationals just to take over the entire global economy. Even in the United States, you'll notice that our domestic firms are worse than multinationals, right? When multinationals are great, they do a great job. All right. So that's what I'll say about government policy. And again, just think about it this way. If every country around the world had good economic policy for the last 100 years, then there would be almost no absolute poverty left on earth. If every country had just avoided socialism, avoided expropriation, right? Avoid, let's see, what's our other one? Yes, avoid autarky, right? Avoid those things and then welcome multinational corporations. Right? These are the like pursue economic freedom generally, do all these things, but just especially avoid total stupidity. Then every country already could be rich. Brazil would be a first world country already. Just done it for the last 100 years. Remember, so if you just get if Brazil had just had, even 1 percentage point higher growth per year for the last century, that would add up to an enormous gain. Right. So I think you would be close to or maybe even above the US level if you had just had 1 percentage point higher than what you had.
But the problem of avoiding total stupidity is just the key part. So we are just far from that.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not like, obviously a lot of countries have had totally stupid policy for many decades. So in a sense, it's not easy. But on the other hand, it's not like you have to get great policies. You just have to go and we just admit, like, this stuff is stupid. We're done. We're not doing it anymore. We've been totally wrong. Anyone who says otherwise, like, terrible, bite your head off. All right. Now, of course, as you probably know from Brazil, it's much more popular to blame first world countries for problems in the third world than to blame the third world countries themselves. I actually want to say that first world governments are to blame for a lot of poverty in the third world, but for a totally different reason than most people say. So the usual complaint is that first world countries are engaged in some kind of neo-imperialism and that they are trying to do something bad to your economies. And so, the real problem is that first world governments, the problem is not that first world governments are trading with you too much, is that they're trading with you too little. Right? In particular, they are not trading the most important good that the third world has to offer, which is labor. Right? So all first world countries heavily restrict low-skilled immigration. Every single one. Right? Every first world country. If Albert Einstein wants to come to the U.S., he can probably come. But if a guy that works as a janitor wants to come to the U.S., it's extremely hard to get in. And yet, when economists just do a basic estimate, how much would the global economy gain if we got rid of trade barriers between the first world and the third world for labor? Standard estimate says that this would double the production of the world. So over here, I've got a table of different estimates of gains as a share of world GDP from different policy reforms. Now remember, 1% of world GDP is an enormous amount. 1% of world GDP is like $700 billion. Right? So 1% of GDP is not a small amount. So when you see, like 1.8% for all foreign barriers to merchandise trade, we're talking about over $1 trillion. But still, go down there, the barriers to merchandise trade, single digits, capital flow, single digits, and then all barriers to labor mobility, single or double or even triple digit gains. Right? And again, we should expect this massive increase in production, what researchers often call $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk, would overwhelm the distributional effects. Why? So because a holding scale constant, these first world regulations, these are first world regulations that are harming Brazilians. They drastically reduce third world workers' income and often by a factor of 10 or more. Right? Brazil probably wouldn't be as bad because you're richer, but could easily be reducing the wages for third world workers by a factor of 5, say. Right now, in the United States, people often get very angry when you talk about this being in any way Americans' responsibility, the first world responsibility. Right? And I say there is this long intellectual tradition which unreasonably blames the first world for failing to solve third world poverty with foreign aid. So this long tradition saying, look, if Americans would just go and give half their production to Brazil, Brazil wouldn't be poor anymore. All right, it's like, yeah, I guess maybe, but assuming your government doesn't totally waste it. But all right, fine, you could go and solve a bunch of strangers' poverty by giving them half your money too, right? Does that make it your fault? It seems like a strange view. So anyway, what I say is that this tradition is right for the wrong reason. All right, the people that blame the first world are actually right for the wrong reason. So this lack of state-to-state charity is not culpable. That is just an unreasonable and unfair expectation. But draconian regulation of the international labor market is actually culpable, right? Because this is not a case where you're just refusing to give charity to strangers. It's a case where you're saying people are not free to go and take a job from a willing employer, which I say is a very big moral difference. All right, now again, many people are just so incredulous about this. It's like, no way, no way. You can't say it's our fault for just failing to let people take jobs here. Yes, that's terrible. All right, so how can immigration restrictions cause so much poverty? And the answer is they trap so much talent in low productivity countries. Like, are our janitors really so much better than your janitors? It's the same job, virtually. So, maybe American janitors are 20% better somehow. They have more familiarity with modern cleaning equipment, but how long would that take to learn, right? So, and yet, so typical pay for American janitor would be about $30,000 a year. All right, so how much would a Brazilian janitor typically make in a year?
I don't know. Let's make something really rough here. 2,000, 3,000. How much does a janitor get here in Brazil? 3,000 reais, maybe $600 a month.
Yeah, I don't think you make 3,000 reais.
2,000
mostly.
Maybe. 2,000.
Maybe.
2,000 reais.
And is that in the formal? And I'm guessing, is that in a janitor in the formal sector?
It's formal, yeah,
yes.
So what about a janitor who works in a small restaurant? What does he make?
Oh, I think even less than that. Maybe we can say about $400 per month, maybe $300 per month.
$300 a month.
Yeah.
So you can make almost 10 times as much in the United States.
Yes.
You were doing the same job, right? And why not? Of course, there's transportation costs and difficulty of moving to a new country, but there's little doubt that a lot of janitors would move to the U.S. if they could go and make 10 times as much money here, right? So like people, when they get this option, lots of people are delighted to get this option, of course. All right, now there's a bunch of complaints about letting in low-skilled immigrants, especially. We can talk about those in the Q&A. My latest book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, says all the complaints are greatly overrated. And what I'm going to do in this poverty book is I'll double tap. So do you have that expression in Portuguese? You know what double tap is? Double tap is in a movie when you seem to kill the bad guy.
Yeah.
You drop your weapon and walk away or turn your back. No. A smart victim in a horror movie, once the bad guy's on the ground, you empty your gun into him. Right? Or a zombie movie. You don't just hit the zombie on the head and say, I assume he's okay, or assume he's dead. You finish the zombie.
Yes, you shoot 100 times and then, yeah.
Yes. So, all right, now we come to the very controversial part of the book. This is the part almost all questions are about. And no matter what I do, people still only want to talk about this part of the book, right? This is not the main part of the book. It is one thing I do in the book, but somehow it bothers people so much that it's almost the only thing they can remember when I talk. All right, so possibly by warning you, that will change the result. All right, I'm happy to talk about this too, but I don't only want to talk about this. All right, so anyway, if third and first world governments stopped causing poverty, there would not be much absolute poverty left. So third world governments had just had much better policy for the last 100 years. If first world governments let people move there and get a job, then there just wouldn't be much absolute poverty left. And remember, to benefit from immigration, you don't have to move yourself. A family member can move and send money home. And this is a very important source of income for many countries. And probably not, for Brazil, let's see. So probably like how many Brazilians are allowed to work in Portugal?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Not many. Well, then probably not many. If you don't know, then not many.
No. And Portugal, I think Portugal is not it's been the target for Brazilians that want to live abroad and to immigrate for just a couple of years. And I think it's a recent phenomena, you know. So I don't know if the numbers really about that.
Right. Okay. All right. So anyway, but like, you know, even after first and third world governments get their policies to be reasonable, some absolute poverty would remain. Why? So part of it's bad luck. Like if you're just born quadriplegic, then it's very hard for you to take care of yourself, right? And maybe your parents didn't get insurance for you. So in fact, it's such an unusual problem, they probably didn't. So that's one thing. But the second one is irresponsible behavior. Irresponsible behavior. How do you say irresponsible behavior in Portuguese?
Comportamento irresponsável.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Okay. Now, philanthropists have long distinguished between what they call the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. This was classic in 19th century English philanthropy. All right. So just a point of vocabulary. The deserving poor are those who are not morally to blame for their poverty, and the undeserving poor are those who are. Okay, of course, it's a continuum in the real world. All right, now this rhetoric of calling some people deserving and some undeserving is out of fashion, and people sometimes even get angry at you for saying it, and yet almost everybody still believes it. Right? So when someone pleads for your help, you naturally want to know why they need your help. Were there reasonable steps that they could take or could have taken to avoid poverty, or was it something that was totally out of their control? All right, now let's think more about this irresponsibility. All right, so here are some reasonable steps that I will suggest, and which most Americans have no problem with, regardless of their political views. And I'm guessing most Brazilians don't have any problem either. You tell me. All right, reasonable step. Work full time, even if the best job you can get is not fun. All right, so someone says, hey, I'm poor. It's like, well, couldn't you get a job? Yeah, but the best job I can get isn't fun. So I should get to be supported by you for free, Mom. Right. So you so like, I just want my parents to support me and do no work because I don't like the jobs that I can get. Right. So it doesn't seem, it seems like a reasonable step would be to work full time and to say, yeah, well, you shouldn't expect your first job to be very fun. Secondly, another reasonable step, spend your money on food and shelter before cigarettes and cable TV. Seems like a reasonable point. If someone has money for cigarettes and they say, hey, you have to help me buy my food, it's like, well, why didn't you just not buy cigarettes and buy your own food? Like, well, yeah, but I like smoking, and you won't feel sorry for me to buy me cigarettes, but you will feel sorry for me if I don't have food. Like, well, then no. And here's another reasonable step. Use contraception if you can't afford a child. Use contraception if you can't afford a child. All right, now, in rich countries like the United States, following these steps lets able-bodied adults reliably avoid absolute poverty. So there is a body of work on what is called the success sequence. The success sequence. What's that in Portuguese? Success sequence.
Sequência de sucessos.
All right, yes. That's about what I thought.
It's beautiful, yeah.
About what I thought. All right, and what this research says is that the poverty rate for Americans who, first of all, finish high school. Second of all, work full time. 3, marry and wait until 21 to have children. Do those 3 things, and your poverty rate is only 2%. Poverty rate is only 2%. The poverty rate for those who do zero, who do none of those, is 77%. All right. Now, if you look more closely, non-work is the main proximate cause. Non-work is the main proximate cause. So if you dropped out of high school and you're not married and you have a bunch of kids, well, without having a parent to help you support them, but you still have a full-time job, then you still probably won't be in poverty. But here's the main problem. Impulsive sex is usually the root cause, because yes, if you have impulsive sex, you'll have kids without a partner probably. And if you have kids without a partner, how are you going to work full time? It's very hard. So even if it really were true that all you need is a job and you can avoid poverty, but if you do things that make it really hard to work full time, like have kids without a partner, then you are going to have trouble working full time, trouble keeping the job because you have conflicting responsibilities. And so you will end up being poor as a result. So again, that's why I say impulsive sex is usually the root cause. And actually, for writing this book, I've read an enormous amount of sociology, and it is very striking. So we think of sociology as being a very left-wing and socialist discipline. And in a sense, it is. But the sociologists who do this kind of work, usually the ideology is in the first chapter and the last chapter of the book. And all the middle chapters are, I went to a poor neighborhood and I talked to a whole lot of people and found out they're having tons of impulsive sex and they have a bunch of kids and they don't know how to support them now. And furthermore, what's striking, and many of the parents of teenagers, they're saying, please don't do what I did. I totally messed up my life. Don't. And the teens are like, yeah. All right. Right. So that, right. Again, so it's not like the teenagers don't have people telling them what not to do. It's not like they don't see it. It's just they're not listening. Right. So they're doing what would seem to be irresponsible, not just according to me living in my nice suburb, but according to their own parents. All right. Now, what about poor countries? Right. How well does responsibility work in poor countries? Well, at least it makes absolute poverty far less likely. Right. So it may very well be that if you're in Brazil, you could go and finish high school and work full time and marry and wait until 21 children, and you still might be pretty poor. Right. But it's still good advice. Still good advice. All right. So there has been some research on how the poor around the world spend their money. So here are some facts that come from Banerjee and Duflo, Nobel laureates a couple of years ago. The global poor spend about 5% of their income on alcohol and tobacco, and about 10% on festivals. Right, so weddings, funerals, parties, that kind of thing. All right, so, and again, if you think about all this is money which could have been saved, and you say, well, you know, the poor aren't using banks. Often they're going and borrowing on the street at very high interest rates. So if you just took that 15% savings and used it to pay off your debt, or actually lend money out to other people, right, then you could be earning very high interest rates. Right. There's also a good book called by Collins and co-authors called Portfolios of the Poor that looks at the way the poor spend their money. Then there's an American columnist, Nicholas Kristof, went to Africa and also wrote about what he saw with African poverty. And here's what he published, and he was not canceled for this. Quote, if the poorest families, he's talking about Africa, spend as much money educating their children as they do on wine, cigarettes, and prostitutes, their children's prospects would be transformed. Much suffering is caused not only by low incomes, but also by short-sighted private spending decisions by heads of households. Okay. Now, even though I discussed three main blameworthy causes of poverty, remember, bad economic policy in the third world, especially against multinational corporations, bad immigration policy in the first world, and this, even though I discussed three main blameworthy causes, 95% of the questions about this talk just attack the moral philosophy of a poverty irresponsibility link, right? And the standard saying in English is, hey, you're blaming the victim. You're blaming the victim, you bad, bad man. All right, now here's what I say. You should never blame the victim. I absolutely agree. Do not blame the victim. But who is the victim? Who's the victim? You should have an open mind about that. And I say, look, if you go to the burn ward of a hospital and you say, hey, did that guy with burns all over his body, was he the arsonist? Well, say, hey, you're blaming the victim. Well, he's not the victim if he was the arsonist. Let me investigate the crime and find out. Maybe he actually burned himself up accidentally while burning down the building. All right, maybe not. Maybe he really was just a perfectly innocent person who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we should be able to ask questions. And if there was a detective that wouldn't even check to see whether the person in the hospital had just bought gasoline an hour before, like that would be a terrible policeman if he did not at least investigate and say, well, let's at least rule out that this person caused the problem. So who's the victim? So here are some totally non-fanciful hypotheticals. A dad spends money on alcohol and prostitutes when his kids are hungry. This actually happens in the real world. It's not just some weird philosopher's example. You know, they say, oh, it really actually does happen. There, you know, so like so many of the works of sociology that I've read, on the one hand, there's like, oh God, it's just so terrible. My kids are hungry. And like you're drinking right now. You're drinking alcohol now. How about you stop drinking alcohol, take the money you spend on alcohol, buy food, give it to your kids. How about that? It's like, well, that wouldn't totally solve it. First of all, maybe it would. And second of all, it would help. So why are you drinking? And I'm like, well, I really like drinking, right? That kind of thing, which, yeah, it's kind of funny when you read about it, but when you realize like, that's what my dad is doing, is he drinking the money from my bread. What kind of a father would do that? It's terrible and blameworthy, right? Or here's another one, but a couple who barely support themselves routinely have unprotected sex. What do they think is going to happen? Right? Or how about an able-bodied adult lives from crime when the unemployment rate is 3.5%? Right? There's a low unemployment rate. There are plenty of low-skilled jobs that you could get, and instead he mugs people. All right. So all these cases, like if these are cases where the poor are not to blame for their own poverty, who is? Who is? All right. Now, on this micro level of how you treat other individuals that you know, almost everyone thinks that blame morally matters. Right. So yeah, you guys watch Homer Simpson over in Brazil. What do you call him in Brazil?
It's the same thing, Homer.
Yes,
It's
you
the
say
same
Homer?
thing. Yeah, we say Homer Simpson. Yeah, the same names.
Yes, yeah. Like, so do you say it with an American accent, or is it
Yeah, we say Homer. Yeah, it's the same idea.
You say Homer or Omer?
Homer with like the H here.
You say
It's
the
the
H,
same
okay.
thing.
Not like
Yeah,
Spanish.
we
Okay.
say.
All right. So just picture Homer Simpson. This is something he actually said. We could sit around all day arguing about who was drunk at work, who cheated on who crashed whose car. Right. These are all questions that at a personal level you care about. Right. So your friend doesn't do his job at work because like you're his coworker and he doesn't do it. And then he says, hey, help me out. I'm going to get fired. It's like, well, you're the one that was drinking on the job. Why is it that I have to stay here and do your job for you? Seems important. Right? It's not like, like there was an accident or I got really sick and can you help me out so I don't lose my job? It's like you didn't get sick, you drank on purpose, right? Or it's not like someone slipped alcohol into your water and then you accidentally got drunk, right? Or we argue about who cheated on who. When couples are arguing about adultery, yes, it matters who cheated on who. One person broke the promise, and it is their responsibility to get things fixed if it can be fixed, right? Or who crashed whose car? Yeah, someone borrows your car and crashes it. Like, well, what happened? Right? Since someone rammed into me when I was parked. All right, maybe, but well, I just didn't worry about the stop sign. I thought I could make it, and I gotta crash your car. Sorry. Can I borrow it again when you buy a new one? Right, but at the macro level, the level of policy and social philosophy, there is this high status view that says blame doesn't matter, only the effectiveness of solutions. Who cares why some people are poor? What difference does it make? Yeah, maybe they're drinking all day, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't help them just the same as anyone else. And my core premise is blame does matter. Blame does matter. And you already think that it does matter. It's just ideology that makes you say that it doesn't matter for social policy. So, blame affects, first of all, what counts as a social problem? If your friend is going to lose his job because he drinks, is that your problem? Yeah, it's not my problem. It's your problem. So if strangers are in poverty because they're drinking, how is this the problem of strangers? Right? Blame affects who's morally obliged to change their behavior. This is, of course, a lot of the reason why we talk about blame is, look, it's your fault though you're getting fired because you were a bad worker and you could have improved. Then it's like, well, so what's the solution? How about the solution is you start working harder and I live my life. I live my life, you work harder. That's your solution, right? And of course, also affects who should be shamed for failing to change their behavior, right? So if the reason your kids are hungry is because you're drinking, this means, hey, you're a bad dad. You're drinking alcohol when your kids are hungry. That's terrible. You shouldn't do that. Right now, if blame really doesn't matter, why do people argue about blame so much? Right? Yeah, blame totally matters. Almost everyone thinks it matters. It's just an official dogma that it doesn't matter. People don't really believe the dogma. Right now, here is Paul Krugman on blame. So this is what really strikes me. Even thinkers who officially are against blaming people for bad behavior normally continue to blame at least one lifestyle. So here are two different quotes from Paul Krugman. You guys know about Paul down in Brazil? Yeah, so most famous progressive economist on earth, probably. All right. So here's something he said in 2012. Nobody, not William Julius Wilson, not Larry Mitchell, not yours truly, denies the bad effects of reduced opportunity would be much less if people always did what was in their best long-term interests. But people often don't, which is why loss of economic opportunity can be socially as well as economically destructive. That's not crude materialism. It's saying that people are human. So yeah, like people lose their jobs and then they start drinking up with the family money. It's people are human. Don't judge. But 2013, maybe I actually am right, and maybe the other side, namely Republicans, actually does contain a remarkable number of knaves and fools. So knaves are like bad guys, villains. All right. So he's not like when someone votes Republican, Krugman doesn't say, well, you got to understand he comes from a Republican area of the country and his family and friends Republican. And yes, Republicans are terrible, but no individual Republican really be blamed. You know, like they're product of circumstances. He doesn't make excuses for them. And of course, once you start making excuses, there's no end to it. Even a very wealthy elite Republican, you say, well, look, when you grow up in a family that rich, it's just very hard to sympathize with the problems of the poor. It's very hard to go and listen to someone who tells you that you're really the problem. So I forgive them too. Paul does not forgive these people. Paul only forgives the people that he wants to forgive, and everyone else he holds to normal moral standards, right? And I say, look, like not only is this hypocritical, but he's right the second time. Like it's the second time. This Paul says, look, there's a reasonable way that you could have avoided your problem, then you should have done it, and don't come crying to me about it not working out. Okay, so now finally, is this the whole story? No way. Right. So the meta lesson, the lesson that I get from just reading a lot. So like every simple theory of blame is wrong. Right. So like in this talk, I definitely wanted to talk about the horrors of housing regulation, but there just wasn't time. Actually, that is the other book I'm writing right now. I'm doing another graphic novel called Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing, talking about how ridiculous American housing regulation is and how grossly it increased the price of housing, especially in desirable areas of the country. So that's something else I could have put on. And it's, first world countries, housing regulation is a big problem, but many very poor countries. I'm guessing in Brazil, it's not that easy to build stuff in downtown Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, right? Right. So if you want to build a new skyscraper, how hard is that?
More than hard,
yeah.
Almost impossible.
Yes. All right. And this is a country where you've got people who sleep on the street. Right.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
Yeah,
but someone who wants to go and build a giant skyscraper and create an enormous amount of new housing can't do it. All right.
The bureaucracy is going to take years and years, and then those people are going to disappear.
Yep. All right. But I'll still say there's some factors that are far bigger than others. So first of all, and again, I like to think about this as just a series of solutions, each one of which, if they've been taken, could have solved the problem by now, but we should think about all of them. So first of all, absolute poverty would be almost gone if third world governments had adopted decent economic policies 50 years ago and stuck to them. So if back in 1971, Brazil had adopted the policies that Chile is famous for, you would basically have almost no absolute poverty now. All right, so could have been done. So I think probably Chile was a little richer than Brazil before Allende came to power. I'm not sure, but I think so. But it wasn't an enormous difference. And now there's this enormous difference that you know about. All right, so even so, even if third world governments had changed nothing, absolute poverty would also be almost gone if first world governments had just allowed people to escape from third world countries. So if the United States and Canada and Europe and Japan had welcomed Brazilian immigration, then the problem of poverty would have been solved in two main ways. One is poor people would have just left and gotten high-paid jobs in other countries. Two is they would have sent home a lot of their money, so the people that didn't leave would also have a much higher income. And then on top of that, probably many of the immigrants would have invested in Brazil. They would have returned for retirement. There'd be a lot of other kinds of tourism. So there'd be many ways in which this would have benefited not just the Brazilians that left, but the Brazilians that stayed behind, right? And maybe if a whole lot of people were leaving the country, even the government of Brazil would say, gee, we need to really make this country less terrible so that people want to stay, right? And then finally, even if third world governments or third world governments had kept their policy the same, even if first world governments continue to restrict migration as they do, even so, absolute poverty would be greatly reduced if the poor live responsibly. And again, I'm not talking about win a Nobel Prize. I'm talking about very basic behavior like finish high school, work full time, get married before you have kids. Very simple things that don't require, don't require a saint, don't require a genius, just stuff that is obvious to almost everyone around the world, but many people don't do it even though it's obvious because it's easier to be irresponsible than to be responsible. All right, so I'll stop the screen share now and I will now take questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bryan. Thank you. It was great. We have some questions, and I think Fernando is going to ask you the first one.
Okay, great.
Please.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the great lecture.
Oh, thank you. You're very welcome.
So I want to ask you, do you believe in a behavior level that religious practice can be allies in relation to human improvement?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the approximation of virtues and keeping the vices addictions distant?
Oh yeah, that is a great question. So I would say that some religions have a fantastic track record, like Mormonism. All right, Mormonism is great on this. And other very conservative Christian denominations have a great record on this. On the other hand, I don't know that Catholicism has done so well, right? So that's so of course there's a lot of preaching about irresponsible behavior in Catholicism, but there's also a very forgiving attitude. I mean, which again, it varies by country. So the Irish are famous for having a very Protestant Catholicism, right? So in Ireland, they say the rules and they like, thou shalt not commit adultery. In Ireland, in Ireland, we mean thou shalt not commit adultery. You'll go into hell if you commit adultery. On the other hand, Southern Europe and Latin America, it's like, well, okay. I mean, so there was some adultery and yes, it's a sin, but they're not, but people aren't priests, they're not monks, they're not nuns. We got to be forgiving about it. So I'd say that it varies a lot. So again, historically, probably there was a less tolerant attitude in the Catholic Church, although it's also true that before the welfare state, I think there's just many more sources of pressure for responsible behavior because really your family, they know they'll be responsible for you in earlier times, and they just don't have a lot of spare resources to help. So you can understand why people had these what we call Victorian attitudes during these times, because if you have impulsive sex in Victorian times, the only people that will help you are probably going to be the mother's family, if them. So, but yes, I mean, in principle, religion can be very effective. Although, also I would say that Catholicism has done a lot to undermine these norms with what's called Catholic social teaching. So I assume you're familiar with Catholic social teaching. So at least in the United States, or liberation theology being even worse.
Theologia, yeah.
Yes, but so like many times when I talk to religious Catholics in the U.S., they say, look, it's just evil to ever blame the poor for poverty. They're not to blame, definitely not. And if that's what you're preaching, then I think that the religion is causing more irresponsible behavior by trying to put the blame onto the people that are upholding standards instead of the people that are violating standards. So your bottom line is some religions are great for this, others are not so great. I know you said you're at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo, so I don't know what kind of Catholicism you practice there. I think you'll agree there are many kinds of Catholicism, and some are almost a blanket invitation to sin, and others are strict. And if you're kind of strict, then I think you're helping. If it's not so strict, or if it's saying, shame on all of you people for judging others, then you're making things worse. So anyway, you tell me what kind you have. I don't know.
Yeah, the Catholic universities here in Brazil, they are connected to the Vatican, but they are just the most open spaces for discussion and everything. So, for example, here we are at the laboratory, we have groups, research groups that discuss Judaism, that discuss philosophy, that discuss evangelical movements and everything. So here we have like a complete free environment to discuss those things. Of course, we are connected to the church, but we are very open to discuss. And we have another question from Professor Pondé, please. Open your mind. Yeah.
Bryan, could you please say in few words, what is the myth of the rational voter?
Sure thing. What is the myth of the rational voter? The myth of the rational voter is that if something is popular, then it's a good idea. That's the simplest way of putting it. So anytime someone looks at a policy that wins and says, well, the people have spoken, let's do it. It's like, well, wait a second. So what do they know, right? Could they be wrong? Could the majority be deeply wrong? Right. So, as a social scientist, I would phrase it more precisely. And I'd say it is the idea that the beliefs of the general public are at least correct on average. So while non-experts might err in some ways, there'll be other non-experts who balance them out. And so the average view is still reasonable, right? Which then in turn leads to policies chosen by democracies to being very reasonable policies. Right. So I wrote The Myth of the Rational Voter to undermine this idea and say, look, just because a policy is popular doesn't make it good or right or reasonable. And furthermore, when you really look at the data, you will see that in general, especially the economic policies that are popular with the public are deeply in error, especially anti-market policies, anti-foreign policies, things like this are generally very popular with the public, and yet they are bad for the public. So that's my short answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think, let me say something. So I think Jason Brennan and Larry Bartels agree with you.
Oh yeah.
Don't you think?
Yep. Well, yeah, Jason and I just had lunch a couple of weeks ago. In real life, a real lunch.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We are looking forward to doing it with among ourselves as well. Professor Bartels is going to be here with us, and Jason Brennan was here with us last year. Yeah. Okay. It was great. Let me ask you another thing. What are the cultural conditions of the third world in order for your proposals to be thought, debated over, and shared? What do you think?
So I know there's a popular view that you can't get any progress before you totally transform the culture. I think that's much too strong. All right. So I think that there are actually very few cultures that are as dysfunctional as all that. I think so. Like in terms of personal behavior, I think it is very hard to find any culture where people don't acknowledge that irresponsible behavior is a problem. I mean, it's not like there's some cultures they say, oh yeah, it's very responsible to go and have impulsive sex and then have the dad go and not help take care of kids. It's not actually normal in any society or any subculture. What varies really is how, first of all, like how tolerant the attitude is. Again, it's like, is it like that's terrible and will not be tolerated, right? And I will not be part of it, or is it like, well, yes, it's a shame, but people are human. So I think it's not so much that you need to change people's ideas as just to get them to follow the most basic part strictly. And again, notice I'm not saying anything strong that the church might push. I'm not saying like abstinence. Just saying like if you aren't ready to support a child, use contraception. So again, possibly the church would be opposed. Although this is Brazil, so maybe you don't care what the church says. I don't know.
No, we have very strong policies here, educational and sexual strong policies related to that.
So but, even at Catholic University?
Yeah, of course.
Really?
Yes,
so at Catholic University, you tell kids to use contraception?
No, because the Catholic University is not necessarily related to Catholicism as a whole. It's a different kind of thought here.
Right. Yeah. So like American Catholics are the same way too. Americans don't care much what the Pope says either. Yeah. I remember my mom lecturing our parish priest about and arguing with him. It's like, well, like, why do you come here if you think he doesn't know what he's talking about? But anyway, and then similarly in terms of the political culture, I would say that really all that you need in Brazil to have a dramatic improvement in your political culture is just two things. One is humility, and just to say, look, just because Brazilians do it this way doesn't make it a good idea. Let's not assume we're right. Let's take a look at other countries that are similar to us and see what they've done and see if we have something to learn. And then just look at Chile. All right, that's really all you need to do is humility and observation. Put those together and you can fix Brazil. Right?
Yeah.
Now you may say, humility, we don't have a humility. Observation, we're not going to do that. It's like, all right, this is not requiring that you go and throw out your whole metaphysics or get a new epistemology or study metaethics. I'm not asking that people become philosophers or go to get a PhD in anything. Just saying, look, just calm down. Stop chanting freaking slogans, Brazil for the Brazilians. Like, is it really that great here in Brazil? Look around. You think this is a tremendous triumph? It's just not. There's like other countries that have done a lot better. And why don't we just admit it and then try to copy them? Go and ask them, look, we're not doing so well here. What did you do in Chile? Free market reforms. All right, let's try that. Let's try that. And let's not give up in 3 months either. Let's not just say, oh, it didn't work in 3 months, didn't deliver. Like, you know, if you can try socialism for 30 years, you can try free market reforms for 5 years, right? And I'd say this is really all you need to ask of people, right? Now, again, this doesn't mean that it's likely to happen, but it doesn't require an enormous cultural transformation. And again, I'm sure there are plenty of people in Brazil who have humility and observe the world.
Okay.
There's got to be plenty of people like that already. So just to go and say, look, those are the best Brazilians. They're the great Brazilians. The humble, observant Brazilians are the great ones. And the arrogant, blind people are bad. They're the bad Brazilians. And they should not be the future Brazil. They're just going to give us more problems. So let us say no more. I'm sick of you arrogant, unobservant people. No, bad.
Let me ask you another thing. How has your defense of elimination of international barriers in the first world has been accepted or not by the North American society? How is the reaction of the political elites? Yeah. And does this idea resonate with the Republican and Democrats?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying I'm one man. I'm just one man.
We know. Just for you.
That's actually a Simpsons reference when Homer says, "I'm just one man."
One man.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, look, I write books. I've been on TV. I do podcasts, but of course, there's an enormous anti-immigration feeling in America, and it's not just Trump. It's not just Republicans. Democrats are also very anti-immigration. By which I mean, Democrats are also generally very opposed to letting in more low-skilled immigrants, right? Okay. So I'm starting off trying to argue for something that's extremely unpopular across the board, right? So I will in no way claim to have had any great success. The most I'll say is I think I persuaded a lot of very smart young people, including among the elite. So I mean, I've gone and talked to effective altruism clubs at Harvard. I think young people like that, I think that they have changed their mind, not just for me, but I think I am maybe 1/5 of the persuasive force that they've encountered that has made them think differently. So, and again, I think that in future decades, a lot of these elites will wind up having positions of power and influence, and that things will continue to move towards freer immigration, not free, but freer. Mm-hmm. I'd also say that there is, over the last 20 years, a big change in Americans' views on immigration. It used to be that less than 10% of Americans favored more immigration. Now about 1 in 3 Americans favors more immigration.
Okay.
So it's still a minority position. And again, I would not claim to be even one of those percentage points. What I do is persuasive to kids at Harvard. It's not persuasive to a random American. I try, but I'm just one person, and of course I'm, I was on my last book, Open Borders, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 1 month, but it's only a month. There are other books that have been on the New York Times bestseller list for years. Sure. So I can't reasonably say I'm more persuasive and that I persuaded more people than those books. So, I mean, I do think that I have extra persuasive power with a certain kind of elite and idealistic young person. And I think that if you had to choose one group of people to persuade, that's a fantastic group to persuade because they really will have a lot more influence than their numbers suggest. But still, I mean, I've got to be honest and just say I don't see any sign that I have even close to transformed American opinion.
Okay. I have one last question that is from our audience, and it's Pedro. He wrote in Portuguese, so I'm going to translate that. And I'm sorry if it's not going to be absolutely perfect, but I think it's going to be understood.
Okay.
Maybe the question is substituting the element under the judgment instead of analyzing many hypotheses that are based in a reality built by ideologists. Maybe would be the case to relate character and responsibility, those things that manifest in real people with real histories and facts. On the contrary, how to blame general categories as poor, rich, developed, underdeveloped. And this kind of question reminded him the analysis of Theodore Dalrymple in England, the psychiatrist. I don't know if you are aware.
Yeah. It's like Dalrymple, I think.
Yeah. So, what do you think? How to blame those general categories? Do you have a question?
Right. So again, I'd say that it doesn't make much sense to blame a category unless you have constructed the category by definition to be blameworthy. So if you said I'm going to blame the whole category of fathers who spend money on alcohol, cigarettes, and prostitutes when their kids are hungry. All right, so yes, I'll blame that whole category. So, and again, I think that is the kind of thing that Dalrymple would have done as well. That's a lot of the point of his work is the way that middle-class intellectuals treat the poor as if they don't have a choice, and often they do. So yes, like you don't have to drink. It really is true. The bottle does not magically put itself to your mouth, right? I mean, just very striking when you see, there is this idea, of course, in the U.S. that there's the disease of alcoholism and it could affect anyone. Yeah. So I'd really love to have a disease that I would stop having if the price of something went up. Right. Okay. So, if you could get rid of your COVID when the price of a vaccine went up higher, it's like, hey, now I don't have COVID anymore because the price of the vaccine went up.
Fantastic.
That would be amazing, right? But alcohol really is something, like even very severe alcoholics, when the price goes up, they drink less, right? And you can even see the strategic behavior, the classic alcoholic who's hiding alcohol. Why are they hiding alcohol? Because they're trying to avoid the social sanctions and punishments for doing it. Right. And one way, of course, they avoid is just by drinking less or changing the time when they're drinking to when people aren't looking. So, I mean, all these things indicate that, in fact, it is a choice. People can stop and they should be blamed for not doing it. Again, it's not so unreasonable to say, look, it's a beverage. It's not, very well, it's not worth it's not worth the suffering of your children. Stop doing it and do the right thing. Right. Okay. And again, of course, once you go down this road of no, everyone is totally, you can't be blamed. They're so pressured by their circumstances. You really do wind up in crazy ideas like you can't blame war criminals for what they did because it was war. They were in a violent circumstance, and so sure, like anyone would have done it there. It's like it's not true that everyone would have engaged in rape and massacre in a war zone. Some people do, some don't, right? And right. And just to say, well, like poor them, they're victims too. It's like, really? Like the people who murdered all the children, they're victims too. Like, they're not victims. They are perpetrators. And they could have said no. Right now, this is also one where when people study, well, what happens to people who said no in Nazi Germany, for example? What happened to Germans who said no?
Yes.
Right. And it's important to learn, yes, people refuse to carry out murderous orders generally were not punished. So it's like, yeah, but they would have been yelled at. Yeah, someone would have yelled at me, so I murdered some people is not a good excuse.
No.
It's pathetic, really. Right. So say like I murdered him because he was going to murder me. That's a pretty good excuse. But to say like my friends would have laughed at me and called me names because I didn't participate in the massacre. Like, so what? Are you 2 years old? Are you a baby? Right. So just don't murder people that are innocent ever. Okay. Stop it and stop with the excuses and stop making apologies for people doing terrible stuff.
Perfect. So, Bryan, we would like to thank you so much for being here with us, for spending this hour with us. So, we hope to meet you.
Yes, yeah,
in
my pleasure.
person.
Yep. So I did say, I'll confess, I said no to a few invitations from Brazil earlier because I was spoiled by all the other offers I was getting.
Okay.
But anyway, now after a year of barely going anywhere, I'm willing to take almost any travel offer.
You should come to São Paulo. Yeah.
People actually want to see me. Right. I've also had a year of people like, oh my God, you're going to kill me if you want to breathe near me. So I've had enough of that. So anyway, I'm totally vaccinated now. So I wouldn't be afraid to travel. So again, of course, if you guys can't see me or like you can't have a group together to see me, then I guess we should still wait. But I am looking forward to traveling to Brazil. So
yeah, and we are looking forward to get to receiving people, to traveling again, and to be fully vaccinated. So it's our goal. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. All right.
Thank you, Fernando.
Have a great day. Have a great day, Brazil.
Have a great day. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you,
How do you say
bye
have
bye.
a great day? Have a great day in Portuguese.
Tenha ótimo dia.
All right, I'll never be able to pronounce it.
Don't worry.
So,
don't worry.
You know, what Andrea said.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.